Greetings, dear friends! I present to your attention the most common malfunctions and breakdowns that occur on the Opel Vectra C. This is exactly the case when the proverbs about Opel do not apply at all, because Vectra C decays really slowly, much slower than Vectra A and Vectra B or some Mercedes-Benz W210. However, given the age of the car, a used copy will definitely not do without problem areas, and the model still has some sins. Let's start with the most unpleasant thing. The lower door seal here is implemented with one large molding on a steel frame, and it is attached to the threshold holes just above the plastic lining. In fact, the problem is the same as for Vectra B, but here the steel is galvanized and therefore moisture and sand collecting under the rubber band, constant loads and movement when opening the doors lead to visible problems by 15 years. And not 6 to 8, as in of the last generation. Sometimes problems come out earlier, but usually this is a consequence of the accumulation of a large amount of dirt under the plastic and inside the threshold, or damage to the paintwork in the past. On the left, evaluate the aforementioned inner seam of the rear axle and at the same time all the inner surfaces. The lockers here are very conditional. The front wall is not really protected, and the seams and the seal cap remain a very vulnerable part of the body. You also need to very carefully inspect the mounting location of the shock absorber, especially if there are traces of leakage of the shock absorber itself. In this case, the load on the body increases greatly. It is advisable to inspect the cavity under the seal plates in the rear part. Dirt accumulates there and self-corrosion can develop. The pads are attached to 12 caps. It is unrealistic to take them out on someone else's car, but it is in the rear part that you can gently pull off the threshold towards yourself under the trailing edge of the door and look into the gap. It's good if there is a compression to blow out the cavity to remove dirt and assess the condition of the metal. Disappointment with Opel quality usually comes from various little things. There are a lot of these troubles in store here because a large car is actually quite budgetary in terms of solutions. An expensive plastic, savings on fasteners, and the manufacturer's focus on simplicity of design make themselves felt. Micro switches in the locks malfunction, motors fail over time, especially the motor for driving the rear door and trunk lid lock, bumper slats, and fragile like on French. The trapezoid of wipers so easily and naturally. They put bushings from hover. Gas stops serving 10 years and begin to fail. The aluminum base of the mirrors corrodes, causing problems with acidification of the mechanism and simply losing its appearance. The headlight mounts are rather weak. Fortunately, there are repair ones. Lens modules on door style are dead in literally all cars, on rear styles in almost all. Fortunately, the headlight is not so difficult to disassemble, and there are new glasses on it too. The headlight range control fails mainly due to weak body position sensors. They have zero tightness. The turn signal repeaters are also leaking. The repeater lamps are peeling off. There are problems with the contacts and the rear switching unit. The Vectra C's suspension is quite typical. McPherson strut at the front and multi-link at the rear, just like its predecessor. In the fashion of the early 2000s, a huge support bearing in a plastic case was used in front. It does not live in the mode for long. The modernized boot, which appeared after 2004, does not help either. The resource has grown, but still the unit remains a consumable, and the crackle when the steering wheel rotates is a standard fear of the owner. The front arm of the Vectra C has become aluminum, with a non-replaceable ball valve. Its resource is quite decent, 100 plus 1000 kilometers, but the price is rather big, for 350 euros. Non-original options from FAG or Magneti Marelli will cost about 3 times cheaper, and the resource will be smaller but not critical. But Chinese cheap replacements will cost from 15 to 40,000 maximum. If you wish, you can try to install the same replaceable ball in the old lever or buy in Belarus a kit for welding a new mount for a replaceable ball from Lancer. The rear suspension also has its weak points. First of all, the resource of the boomerang is too small, a sickle-shaped lever, more precisely its silent blocks. At first, its price was almost like that of the front one, but over time it fell. Even the original cost 60 to 70 euros and the non-original costs about 25, and the resource is usually acceptable. All the silent levers of the rear suspension are now replaceable, and this is a big plus. By 100,000 run, the rubber bands not only of the boomerang but also of the longitudinal and bearing levers were usually worn out, so the 15 to 20-year-old Vectra will probably have to invest more or less regularly in this. The average bill for a bulkhead is about 200 euros only for levers and silent blocks, not counting shock absorbers and springs, which may also require replacement. By the standards of Opel, the cost of maintaining the running gear of the Vectra C turned out to be too large. Old-school Opelists accustomed to the fact that the suspension wears out by the time the body begins to fall apart, and parts are given for nothing and still pay extra. We are extremely unhappy, so a wave of curses spread throughout the community on a regular basis. Therefore, when reading angry reviews, it is worth keeping the circumstances in mind. By today's standards, the cost of maintenance for a Class D car is quite acceptable, especially since the prices of parts have dropped significantly over the past 10 years. The steering on Vectra is rack and pinion, with EGUR except for the OPC versions and with a 2.8 motor where there is a conventional mechanical pump. Immediately above the set, the original pump for door styling cost 2,500 euros, for restyling about half the price. The CIM block, which was discussed in the electronics section, is about 900 more. Of course, a typical Russian car service with problems arise, and on cars with 200 plus mileage, their occurrence is a matter of time, will offer you just such a budget for repairs. But there is no need to run to sell the kidney. Everything can be restored or replaced with used ones, and new non-original pumps are available literally from 150 euros. How to postpone the onset of doomsday? First of all, you need to know that the pump requires regular fluid replacement, at least once every 30,000. On dirty oil, the pump slowly dies, simultaneously finishing off the rail, where the inner surface wears out. The second typical problem of the rail is oil seal leaks, but this is no longer due to dirt, but due to overheating, since the standard radiator is clearly not enough for proper cooling. With high mileage, the electric motor also brings in. There are regular problems with the wiring onto the pump, and the voltage in the car's onboard network jumps strongly during its operation. Everything is not very well divorced. There are several options for mechanics. With gasoline engines 1.6 and 1.8, they installed an old manual gearbox of the F17 series of our own design. With engines 2.2, a 5-speed F23 produced by Getrack, with engines 3.2 and diesel engines 2.0 and 2.2 again, a 5-speed F35 with gasoline supercharged 2.0, a 6-speed Getragovskaya M32. But with diesels and 2.8T, the most powerful box from the Opel arsenal is the F40. All of these manual gearboxes are equipped with a hydraulic squeeze, which is not cheap, but reliable. The F17 has the most problems, which are developed on the basis of the old F13 box for engines up to 1.6 liters. On the Vectra C, they work with engines from 1.8 to 140 forces, and the car itself is heavy, much heavier than all Vectras before. Even with 1.6 engines on the Vectra B, these F17s were dying regularly, and on the Vectra C the odds were very high. When buying, it is imperative to listen to her on the lift for their characteristic howl. First of all, the front bearing on the secondary shaft dimension 47x27x19.5 dies, at the same time killing the seat on the shaft. Over time, there are also problems with the backlash of the input shaft. If nothing is done, then the box body gets irreversible damage, and wear items finish off the differential. The latter, by the way, can suffer not only along the chain due to the bearing, it has enough high loads and/or dirty oil. At a critical moment, the differential breaks out a piece of the box body with the satellite's axle. In theory, you can grind a shaft seat for bearing of a smaller diameter, and if you choose a high-quality bearing replacement with a good thrust and radial load, then the shaft will still survive. In practice, it turns out that the only possible replacement option is an industrial bearing with dimensions of 20x47x18mm. In this case, the shaft must be grinded down to a diameter of more than 2 times smaller than the factory one. A logical question arises: will the shaft break off from such manipulations? It will surely break off if the shaft is machined in violation of the technology, which happens all the time. A similar story with an alternative option: to make a bushing in the housing for the bearing of the original size. In theory, it is possible. In practice, you need to choose the right material and do everything carefully. The third option is to buy a used F-17, which also not so easy, given that the problem is in the design itself. Almost all of them are already killed, so you need to sort them out before installing any case. There are reinforced differentials, but they are very expensive, more expensive than the gearbox itself. Old-timers will remember that on Vectra B, in case of critical wear, the F-17 was replaced with a much stronger F-16, which did not have such problems, and this KP was worth a penny. Yes, it was necessary to change the drives and hubs, but this is not so important. Alas, it will not work to put the old manual gearbox on the shop, it just rests on the rail. In general, there are two least problematic options. Either buy a new, after factory restoration, box F-17, realizing that the resource is unlikely to be more than 120 to 150,000, or not to mess with the subcompact Vectra C. 5-speed manual gearboxes Getrack F23 series are much stronger, although they are also sometimes die due to bearing wear, but this is extremely rare. Of the shortcomings, we can only recall the switching mechanism, which is very sensitive to backlash, and the difficulty of changing the oil, which must be poured through the upper breather, otherwise the recommended volume will not fit. The M32 gearbox is also Getrackovskaya. It is a modern free shaft and very compact, but there are no less problems with it than with the F-17. Bearings die in the same way most often the output shaft. There is a problem with cooling. When driving at high speed, it heats up above 120 degrees, and it only cools naturally, with air. In addition, the bearings are clearly lacking in lubrication due to defects in the design of the front cover. As with the F-17, it is very easy to kill the differential with bearing with debris. The repair is not cheap, but of the advantages, it can be noted that the bearings can be changed without removing the gearbox from the machine. Over time, the manufacturer changed the problematic front cover M32 for larger bearings, 62mm instead of 55, and provided it with channels for lubrication. The problem has lost its relevance. The box of the F40 series is also 3-shaft and 6-speed, but already its own. There are no more questions with bearings, everything is very reliable. They fail very rarely. You just need to monitor the oil level, but gears made using new technologies sometimes do not differ in quality. In theory, this box holds 450 plus Nm of torque, which is enough for any motor, and in practice this value is even higher, up to 600 Nm. True, sometimes it cuts the gears in harmless situations, for example after a shock load. Usually the third and fifth gears suffer, and the box in this case is not a tenant. the repair does not make much sense. Used ones are extremely cheap. For comparison, with the price of a used F17 at 400 to 600 euros, an F40 in fair condition can be found for 250. Vectra was unlucky and unlucky at the same time with machine guns. With 2.2, 3.2 and 3-liter diesel engines, a rather successful 5-speed IC AW55250 was installed on the car, and then its modernized version AW55251 under the designation AF23 or AF33. With 2.8 T engines and 1.9 diesel engines, a newer 6-speed IC TF80SC was installed, also successful, under the designation AF4026. The trouble is that the most popular cars with 1.6 and 2.8 engines lack normal automatic transmissions. At 1.6 there were no automatic transmissions at all, and at 1.8 only the Easytronic robot was installed. In theory, it was available somewhere with a GM VT20 variator, but in practice it is impossible to find such a car both in Russia and in Europe. Mechanical part of the robot is based on the F17 manual gearbox with all its disadvantages, with electric clutch and gear selection mechanisms. This is a very simple and cheap option for automating the manual gearbox, especially since the ABS has no anti-rollback function and the handbrake is only mechanically driven. Even being in good working order, Easytronic does not work very well. It has problems with starting up the hill and with an irregular rhythm of movement. The box pulls and behaves like a not very experienced driver, but it saves the mechanical part. In terms of the automatic part, the design is as simple as possible, and most of breakdowns are either burnout of the clutch control power stage due to overload or breakdown of the drive motors. There are 3 of them. Often the clutch engine dies. This usually occurs due to wear of the brushes or the wedge of the bearing with runs of 120 to 150,000. Everything is repaired very inexpensively, if you know what to do and the service has no desire to bother you for repairs. Another disadvantage is that the control unit in the engine compartment is not alright even from the factory, and after the naughty handles of the services, it is poured with frightening regularity literally every time the engine is washed. There is also not very high quality wiring and the need for regular adaptation so as not to overload the power part of the drive electronics and improve the smoothness of operation. With runs over 200, selector failures and wear on the mechanics of the shift mechanisms additionally appear. True, with operating on the Vectra C, the 5-speed gearboxes had a serious problem. The heat exchanger in Valeo radiators had a structural defect. As a result, antifreeze got into the ATF, quickly finishing off the box. Later, the radiator was modernized by changing the design of the rings, and after 2004, this problem did not happen again. The early versions of the automatic transmission produced before 2003 are more capricious than the later 55 to 51, with mileage of about 120 to 150,000. They had quite a lot of problems with the valve body, but now you are unlikely to come across such a slow-running early car. In later Vectras, subject to regular oil changes and the absence of overheating, these boxes are very resourceful and can roll 350 plus to the first serious problems, except with replacing the torque converter lock-up lining. Well, to combat overheating, it is advisable to put an additional radiator and filter on them. A stronger 6-speed automatic transmission will initially be more reliable even when operating with very powerful motors. The main thing is, again, to prevent overheating, and in the case of a 2.8T motor, they happen regularly. With active movement in the city, oil overheats up to 120 plus degrees transmission, causing leaks in the automatic cooling system hoses, wear of the oil pump and accelerated aging of the box pistons, followed by pressure leaks. The torque converter here is more complex in design with a lock-up solenoid vulnerable to dirty oil. Like most cars with ISIN, on the hydromechanical Vectra there are troubles due to failures of the automatic transmission selector, but this is rare and inexpensive. And it also indirectly speaks of high, over 350,000 car runs. It should be admitted that Opel's failure to compete with Audi, BMW and Mercedes-Benz is not only due to its image. It is simply cheaper and less fully made, and this is evident in many things. On the positive side, relatively simplicity and maintainability. As in the case of the body, a lot of problems are caused by the operating style with the economy on everything. Many owners like to pour cheap GM 5W30 oil and change it every 15,000, as well as use the most budgetary components and lubricants. Given the hot nature of atmospheric engines, the number of failures due to oil and antifreeze leaks is quite high. The first problems began with the Vector conductors by the age of 5. On the other hand, experienced and responsible owners who understand the features of operation, which reduce oil change intervals and engine temperatures, rejoice at the cheapness and ease of operation of such motors, but not all of them. 1.6 and 1.8 on door style are Z16XE and Z18XE. These are motors in a very old block. They trace their pedigree back to 1982. Its design is literally nothing more. Cast iron block, 16-valve cylinder head, timing belt drive, hydraulic compensators, no phase regulators, coaxial oil pump on the crankshaft, simple thermostat, simple crankcase ventilation, VCG, valves without valves, electronic throttle, ignition module for 4 coils, adjustable intake manifold and the collector on release. Oddly enough, these motors cannot boast of problemlessness and a special resource. The piston group resource is 350 plus 1000 kilometers, rarely more, but the cylinder head turned out to be a weak point. The gaps in the valve guide grew rapidly. The oil scrapper during urban operation and the original oil with replacement every 15 began relatively early, 250,000, mainly due to easily caulking oil scrapper rings, which clearly lacked oil drain holes. The last circumstance added a lot of problems to the Omnes. Nowadays, various decaulking compounds are readily available, and earlier the only way to clean the oil scrapper rings was to bulkhead. Many call it overall, but in most cases no meshing or even removal of the motor took place. In the literal sense, the aforementioned cylinder head with its valve guides adds fuel to the fire. Decarbonizing the rings, replacing the guides, and lapping the valves usually extend the life of the engine by 100,000, followed by a real overhaul with a cylinder bore for the oversized pistons. In addition to the increased chances of an oil appetite, there are problems with breakdowns of the engine control unit. It is located right on the cylinder head here and overheats a lot. And then the owner has a lot of problems, because Opel tried to tie all the systems as tightly as possible to a particular car. As a result, there are certain difficulties with the re-binding of used ECUs, although they have lost their sharpness in recent years. Now they have learned to break almost everything, but in the Zero, the owner often had to buy a new block. On other Vectra C engines, a similar problem also occurs, but much less often, and usually no one bothers with alterations. Minor troubles are encountered with leakage in the intake, breakdowns of the intake geometry flaps, leaks with a clogged VCG, failure of the DPKV and DPRS sensors due to broken wires, caulking in the intake due to the EGR valve, pollution of the DMRV, a weak ignition module. It is solid here, like a seat on Saab, is cheaper but still expensive, and not very good wiring. You can also recall leaks in the cooling system, expensive one-piece original pipes, wear on the throttle, cracks in the exhaust manifold of the simplified form without horns, weak gaskets, delicate corrugations of the exhaust. In short, in order to cheaply operate such a motor at more than 15 years of age, you need to know a bunch of nuances. such as where and from which old engines, which branch pipe is suitable, how to transfer the brains where they are repaired, which throttle seals to change and how to wash, how to disassemble the intake, how best to muffle the EGR and remove oxygen sensors, etc. Yes, all problems have solutions, often inexpensive and effective, but in the stock, these are just rather capricious and weak engines. Only those who know and know how to cook them will get pleasure. Newer engines 1.6 Z16XE 100 HP and 1.8 Z18XER 140 HP formerly belong to the same family, and the differences at first glance are small, except that phase regulators at the inlet and release. In fact, the motor has changed significantly. The block is slightly different, a more reliable cylinder head with channels for phase regulators and two control valves, as oil heat exchanger on the front wall under the collector and a controlled thermostat. All the big advantages: more torque due to phase regulators, more power, no problems with the brains of the engine, a successful exhaust manifold and much less intake coke, because there is no EGR and mass airflow sensor, the valve of which often led to an increase in fuel consumption. True, the new design also received a bunch of disadvantages. First of all, the trouble is that the temperature of the motor has increased. There is a hot controlled thermostat of 106 degrees, and the fans turn on even later. Moreover, the heater in the thermostat often dies. On many firmwares, even the check does not light up, except that the fans turn on already at 80 degrees at full speed. At such temperatures, the wear of all rubber and plastic structural elements is very strong. Ultimately, the cylinder head cover jars, all the gaskets leak, the VKG dies, and the wiring quickly becomes fragile. Almost all the troubles of the motor are associated with its high temperature. Heat exchanger for oil is generally a useful thing, but given the increased temperature of the engine and oil, gaskets begin to leak after 2 or 3 years. This is a real disaster, since it is very difficult to find fluoroelastomers that would withstand exactly 5 to 6 years of operation. Even the original ones are clearly made of cheaper materials, and among the non-original ones there are only installation parties. You can't even rely on expensive ones. The saddest thing is that antifreeze can go into the oil, but there are just enough oil and antifreeze leaks, especially if the temperature is low and the engine is not warmed up. The problem is so acute that many weld that heat exchanger, effectively turning it off. Nobody has thought of buying fluoroelastomers in plates and cutting the gaskets on their own, although the decision is obvious. This motor no longer has hydraulic compensators, so you need to adjust the valves every 60,000. But in fact, the gaps can go away earlier, so checks need to be done. The new VKG system with a PCV valve makes the motor drier. The number of leaks has been drastically reduced, but if the valve breaks, it will drain more oil than the old version. But the engine number on the block is filled with a laser, and it corrodes on a completely dry block. These are the unexpected consequences. The phase regulator system suffers from the ingress of oil coking products into the valve grids at first. The grids need to be cleaned, otherwise malfunctions appear. Sometimes the valves themselves fail, and with runs of 150 plus, you need to change the seals of the phase regulators or the gears themselves due to leaks. The timing belt is reliable, runs 150 plus thousand, but in cold regions, when fogging up, it is better to change it to a maximum of 90,000 and use the original oil resistant. The oil appetite unfortunately occurs with the same approximately millage and under the same conditions. Detonation due to overheating, which can damage the pistons, is also added to the oil. However, not everything is so bad. When the cold thermostat is set at 82 to 90 degrees and the fan switch off temperature drops, the new motors are definitely better than the old ones. In this case, the piston runs its 250 plus without oil consumption, and after that it grows slowly even at intervals of maintenance every 15,000. Heat exchanger leaks are also extremely rare when the temperature drops. The next 2.2 engine, Z22SE 147 HP, belongs to a completely different family. And good news, it can be bought with a normal hydromechanical automatic transmission. The engine looks good, but only at first glance and for those who have not yet owned an Opel. There is an aluminum block, cast iron sleeves, timing drive, balance shafts, and a pump chain. With low mileage and dealer service, the engine is really pleased. It is noticeable more cheaper than 1.8, even restyled. And even with an automatic transmission, the car with it is quite fast and, moreover, economical. But by 120 to 150,000, problems with the timing and with cracks in the cylinder head in the candle valves began to creep out, and very early motors of 2002 could have problems with the chain even with a lower mileage, but there the trouble was eliminated under the guarantee by installing a new chain lubrication nozzle and new type tensioners. Timing problems were not expressed at all in the sharp wear of the chain. Its elongation was usually stable, with a replacement forecast of about 200,000+, which by today's standards is just fine, but for the beginning of the century it is acceptable. It was expensive to change 40,000 for 2006, but once every 200,000 one could be patient. Worse, that began to pull out the studs of the mountings of the damper in the cylinder head. Often with a jump of the chain and the failure of the head, it turned out that the head of the block is not cast, but made of secondary aluminum, from such balls. It does not lend itself to welding, easily cracks when the torque on the bolts and studs is exceeded, and most dangerous when tightening the top-pitched spark plugs. Ceramic valves guides will crack with any problem and need to be replaced. When contacting not the dealer service, a few people observed the tightening torques of the bolts when replacing the spark plugs and the pump with its chain drive, so the number of problems only grew. With 250 plus runs, 2.2 engines often had an oily appetite. It is most often associated not with design flaws like 1.6 to 1.8, mostly due to the poor quality of the original GM oil and inadequately long drain intervals every 15,000, and then it turned out terrible. There are no repair sizes, which is a novelty for Opel engines. Previously, General Motors did not offer such non-repairable motors, and this caused another wave of rage in the Opel clubs. Before the appearance of developments on replacing liners, the appearance of non-original pistons and the reduction in the price of timing kits from Cloyes, this is the manufacturer of the original kit from GM, the motor was considered extremely unsuccessful for a long time. But successful attempts to install a normal cast cylinder head from Z20NET or B207 engines and the reduction in the cost of all components now make the disadvantages not so significant. The 2.2 Z22YH 150 HP engines are a late version of the Z22SE direct injection engine. Problems with fuel equipment for a long time made the engine almost the most demonized, but now there are no particular problems with direct injection. The injection pump is relatively inexpensive. The injectors are repaired, everything is diagnosed. But it still remains more capricious than engines with simple injection, and there is no gain in dynamics and efficiency. Early versions before 2006 are really not worth buying. But on cars after restyling, this is quite a working option if you are ready for the price of repairs for engines of this family and are ready to look for related Chevrolet engines to buy original components. After all, with the departure of GM from our market and the sale of Opel, spare parts in the original became more expensive and partially disappeared. The 2-liter 170 horsepower Z20NET engines have one more designation, B207E or B207R. With such codes, they went to the Saab 923. But they have an engine number according to the Opel catalog, so you can put Swedish engines on German cars without problems with documentation. In fact, this is a supercharged version of the Z22SE engine, but here the cylinder head is cast, so it does not have cracks and problems with the studs. like any supercharged engine. It is much more demanding to maintain, and the 2007-2008 versions are also distinguished by the presence of problems with valve springs. The tuning potential is not very high, up to about 280 forces. With a decrease in prices for a timing kit, the minuses against the general background decrease significantly. Motor 3.2 with the code Z32SE exists in two versions. The Vectra C has an engine in the same block as the 2.5, 2.6 and 3.0 on the Vectra B and Omega B, with a timing belt from the V6 54-degree line. The old motor is not bad, although it is glutinous and heavy. Cast iron block, 24 valves, no phasics, durable belt, good resource and traction. True, it is very large and fits tightly into the engine compartment, so it is not cheap to maintain. The main problem is that the oil pump is weak. With runs over 250, you need to monitor the oil pressure in the summer. You can screw up the liners with 5W30 oil, so it is better to use more vicious ones and put an oil gauge at the same time. Alas, the heat exchanger has not gone anywhere in the collapse of the block, the corrosion of which often leads to the appearance of an emulsion. Breaking exhaust manifolds, a poorly positioned thermostat in the collapse of the block, a confused and old-fashioned vacuum system also add a little hassle. 2.8T motors belong to the new high-feature family, to the LP9 series. Versions of 232-280 forces are essentially variants of one motor. The supercharged aluminum block design is a treasure trove of expensive and odd decisions. It was developed from the other side of the earth, in Australia, and it is strongly felt. It is disposable, like the Z22SE, and has not 2 but 3 chains, plus a lot of funny design nuances like bolt washers, and it was often modernized, taking care of the release of timing repair kits for older versions. In general, it turned out to be another motor not for everyone. It has good tuning potential, but is unreasonably expensive and troublesome to repair. We have very few diesel Vectras, but there are many of them in Belarus. The old diesel engines Opel 2.0 and 2.2 liters are successful only from the point of view of mechanics. Cast iron block, very reliable timing chain and reliable oil pump. It is absolutely impossible to overload them at low speeds. In this mode, the liners are easily worn out on them, and you can leave the crankshaft. All other troubles stem from the presence of a Bashevsky high-pressure fuel pump VP44, which does not like low-quality diesel fuel. Its keys overheat, the mechanics wear out, and it costs like 2 Vectras. However, experienced diesel workers from a neighboring country fix it all, and remove a good 170 forces from the engines. The 1.9 engines that Opel received in cooperation with FIAT are really good. Perhaps the breakdown of rockers and swirl flaps on the more powerful 16-valve versions darkens the idyll a little. Italians also put plastic return tees on the nozzles, which Russian craftsmen break with their fingers at once. The reassembly is done for sealant without gaskets, and in the Russian Outback, the classic red is often used and not oil-soluble, and the quality of work leaves much to be desired. On this, information about the problems of the Opel Vectra C is exhausted. If you know more or do not agree with what you heard, I'm waiting for you in the comments.